Missouri Tigers get their 9th win on the season, final win of the regular season in a game that was very fitting of their regular season to end with, especially with the record at Faurot Field. I believe each home game in SEC play was won by Mizzou by just one possession. First season they've gone undefeated at Faurot since 2010. So, ultimately the season, they don't make the playoffs obviously, but still a step in the right direction for this momentum this program is building, and that's the main thing we want to talk about today. Post-game show at here on Missouri on SI. I'm Joey Van Summer, joined by Michael Stamps here. Michael, 9-3 on the season, another, resilient win from this team. Just what do you take away from this game?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, this is one heck of a fun football team to cover. And, I think I mentioned this to you when we were walking back from Coach Drinkwitz and company's press conference. I wasn't even it was still an impressive win, right? Mm-hmm. But it wasn't impressive to me the fact that they won by one touchdown. It wasn't surprising to me. I wasn't shocked that this is what the game came down to. And it feels as if there was a sense of comfortability with the coaching staff and with the players in these situations that it might seem like they're not playing good, but they still find ways to come out on top and win. And I feel like I've mentioned a lot, in our podcast and earlier weeks about luck and things going the right way for them. And this one, it didn't really seem that way. I mean, there was penalties here and there, but a lot of that was in the first half. It seemed like Missouri just outplayed Arkansas in that fourth quarter and made just enough plays to walk away with a victory. As far as this game specifically, that fourth quarter was another fun one. Mm-hmm. A lot of offense. I mean, I feel like it's worth a shout out that Taylor Green and Andrew Armstrong is quite the connection, and that's a pretty darn good quarterback receiver pair for a 6-6 football team. Green made some remarkable throws on the run while being hit, and Armstrong made some huge, very clutch catches, and almost had that one in the right corner of the end zone that Joseph Charleston just barely batted away that changes the trajectory of the game, and God knows what happens. So. Couple big plays from those guys, and Arkansas played a very good football game. But, as a whole, 9 wins is 9 wins. It feels like that's kind of the takeaway from us as the media and then the players as well. Brady alluded that it could have been 10 wins and that there might be some regret or, reflection there looking back at South Carolina. But, I mean, at this point, why? The game's gone, and, it sucks that there's a playoff chance, especially with, nobody wanting to win football games. And 10-2 Missouri is looking at a college football playoff spot more than likely. Yeah. So there's definitely some reflection and probably some frustration there. But if I saw a tweet earlier today, if this team is disappointed about 9 wins, or if the fan base is disappointed about 9 wins, I think that says a lot about where the program is and where the fan base is and where the culture is that Eli Drinkwitz has grown. And that seemed to be a lot of what they talked about at the post-game press conference, just how this culture has changed and where it was when Brady Cook and Eli Drinkwitz and that group of seniors came in compared to now. I think there's a clear amount of growth.
Right, that's a good point about being disappointed being disappointed in 9 wins and what that says about the standard. And obviously they still have more to accomplish. You don't, at this point with 12-point playoff or 12-team playoff, eventually they got to make it. You can't just settle for 9 wins on the season year in and year out. But Athletics Director Laird Beach had a press conference at halftime today, mainly talking about the stadium project, but also talked about just what it takes to become a perennial contender in college football, college athletics, but then in the SEC in general, and just having to, he talked about that South Carolina game too. And obviously, like you mentioned, with how many upsets have happened in the last 2 weeks of this regular season, and we've talked about it on the podcast too, interesting to look back at if Missouri just finishes the deal against South Carolina, what they're looking at for their postseason now. But what Laird Beach was talking about is just a matter of staying close in that race, because there's going to be so much parity in college football. Obviously, we've already seen the effects of it. The SEC, the middle of the SEC was particularly tough this season. And so just staying close in there, again, they eventually have to get over that hump. But staying close in there to be able to build the right tools, build the right foundation is going to be really important to stay consistent. Eli Drinkwitz talked about after the game, they weren't able to get over that hump this season. I guess you could say they weren't able to get over that hump last year either by, not making college football playoff, but that was a massive step for the program's momentum. And now they have this experience from this year. I think overall from this team, even though it's going to be a completely different group of guys that's leading it really, probably going to be a lot of new faces leading the team, locker room and playing wise next year. But there's a lot to take away from what went wrong from this team. A lot of things coaching staff's going to look back on. At the end of the day, as I've talked about on the podcast, I think the main thing to look back on this season with Missouri is not what would have happened if they win that South Carolina game, but the fact that they really, at the end of the day, probably weren't good enough of a team to deserve a playoff spot. And honestly, with it, how these last few weeks have been playing out, you can make that many arguments.
Nobody is.
Yeah, exactly. But a lot of things to improve on. I mean, we saw it today. We saw the red zone offense was just not there at all. And especially for something that they highlighted. I remember back in the spring, Kirby Moore telling us about all the plans they had to improve the red zone offense. And here we are in the last week of the season. It's been a problem all year where they just can't get it down. I mean, that was the main separator in this game for a big part of it. Like you mentioned, Michael, it felt like Mizzou, for all 4 quarters, really kind of, at the very least, was in it or outplaying Arkansas. Except they just couldn't put points on the board. They had to settle for 2 field goals in the red zone. Again, a problem for all year for them. Going to have to get back to the drawing board with that with Kirby Moore. Also, offensively, the slow starts. Defensively, a solid showing. They had some busts in secondary coverage. Again, I have to reassess things there. But a lot to take away from the season. But one at the end of the day where, kind of to your point, Michael, of, maybe not lucky, but the fact that they are just a few ball bounces away from being 6-7 win team, should be grateful for a 9-win season. So that's that on this year. Obviously, a lot of legacy this senior class leaving behind, and we've heard so much this team this year talk about the standard they want to set, and that senior class was a big part of it, setting that standard, setting that culture that is going to send them into the future. So I think that's it for me. Any other thoughts from you, Michael?
One more thing. Johnny Walker post-game was asked a question about, how Darius Robinson kind of set things up for the next wave of Missouri defenders, and how Johnny Walker was, one of those names. Johnny Walker, Christian Williams were the names that Darius Robinson mentioned in that final press conference. And Johnny Walker didn't name drop anybody, but it's kind of a fun full circle moment to see Johnny Walker in a nearly identical spot after quite the productive season. I would assume, and in my opinion, helped his NFL draft stock quite a bit, in a similar position as Darius Robinson. And he didn't name drop anybody, so there's no, we're not going to get any flash into the future about who's going to have that same leadership role next year, but there's so many guys, who could step into it on offense and on defense. And we were talking about this before. This is, arguably the most fun part of the college football news cycle now, is the roster turnover. Signing day is early signing day is this week, and there's still work to be done there. And then I'd imagine we start seeing transfer portal news, and it's happened for other teams. So no predicting who's going to leave and who's going to join, but this is really where the fun begins, and we're going to start getting a look at this next Missouri Tigers roster.
Right, exactly. I mean, if you're going to be a top-end program, the thing that's going to separate you is how well you recruit and then develop that talent. And obviously a big part of that is, like you mentioned, seeing if they lose any of those guys. But obviously when you look at, the defense line group like Johnny Walker was talking about, Theo Weiss was asked about the wide receivers that are going to take over. There's obviously a lot of young talent there that we saw some flashes out of this season. So, Eli Drinkwood said that their program culture is going to be reflected in how few seniors opt out of the bowl game. I think it will also be true for how many of those guys that they're going to depend on in the future, if any of those guys transfer away. So these next few weeks are going to be that first step of that. Exciting to see what this Missouri team builds for the next season. But that's all we have from Faurot Field this season. We appreciate you tuning into our coverage, and we hope you tune in to it throughout the offseason and then when Mizzou plays in that bowl game.